We are constantly bombarded with the message to save more and spend less. But Bill Perkins thinks we have that backwards. In his book, Die with Zero, he says that too many of us save too much and spend too little too late. I've read this book twice now, and both times I thought, this has so many good ideas. It's such a fresh, spendful perspective on money. But the second time I read it, I started to see a potential problem. So we're going to talk about the good and the bad. I'm Ben, and this is Sketchy Advice, Book Club Edition, where I read someone else's advice and tell you whether I think it's sketchy, in a bad way, not like a cartoony way. Like most personal finance books, Perkins suggests that you are using your money suboptimally. But unlike most personal finance books, he starts by getting to the core of what money actually is. A lot of personal finance advice just kind of treats money as an end-all be-all. Having more money, acquiring more money, that's inherently just a good thing. But Perkins asks us to take a step back. The purpose of money is not to maximize wealth, it's to maximize life enjoyment, which means you're getting the most out of your money not when you're earning it or saving it, but when you are spending it. Now, of course, it makes sense to work to earn more money and to squirrel some of it away for the future, but Perkins thinks too many of us do this on autopilot without thinking critically about how our money is actually affecting our happiness. Because when it comes to happiness, timing matters. Most personal finance books encourage you to put off some things now, deprive yourself a bit now, so that you can have a rich, fulfilling retirement. But when we think about money in terms of life enjoyment, we have to acknowledge that timing is pretty important. There's this trope in movies called Business Dad, where a kid feels neglected by their parent because their parent is always working. And while that's almost kind of a cliche at this point, it is true of a lot of people's experience. The parent is out acquiring more money for their family to make their lives better, while the kid is sitting there just wishing that their parent was there with them. Providing for your family is obviously a good thing, and some people obviously have more flexibility with their income and their time than others. But there is a tragedy to spending so much time trying to get money for your family while missing important windows of time that you could be spending with your family. I can stash money in an account to get to it later, but I can't do the same thing with Knox's childhood. If I want to enjoy these years of his life, I have to invest in that now. The same is true of a lot of other experiences. If you want to backpack around Europe or run a marathon, that's just going to be a lot more doable when you are younger and healthier and have more energy and flexibility than when you are older and tired and want to watch Jeopardy instead. Die with Zero is a provocative title for this book, but it gets to the point. The point of your money is to spend it on the things that bring you joy, not to have a massive pile of money left over when you die. If you think about it, money that you have left over after you die basically represents years that you worked for free. It's experiences you didn't get to have because you wanted to save more money. If we put off life experience until retirement, we're going to find that a lot of life experiences are not as accessible or just not as enjoyable to us when we get there. And timing is especially important because of the role of memory. This is one of my favorite ideas in this book. It's good personal finance advice to save a lot of money early because that money can compound over time. We've all seen the crazy charts comparing Billy and Jimmy and who makes more money, blah, blah, blah. Perkins argues that the same is actually true of experiences. But instead of getting financial dividends, you're getting memory dividends. When I was 17, me and my high school buddies went on a trip to Colorado, no parents, to just climb a mountain. And it was really fun while we were doing it. But it's also really fun to remember it. To remember waking up to find a porcupine had attacked our tent, or how serene the lake at our campsite was, or the view from the summit of Mount of the Holy Cross. When I think back on those things, it's like I get to double dip into them. I get to take a little bit of that joy and bring it into the present. Even more so when I get a chance to reminisce about it and laugh about it with those same high school buddies. Now, since I had that experience when I was 17, I have years and years and years of my life where I'm going to continue to look back on that and get joy out of it. Those are memory dividends. And just like with financial compounding, the earlier you have those experiences, the more time you have to enjoy them. We think we retire on our wealth, and while that's technically true, when it comes to our joy, we retire on our memories. People don't talk about the size of their 401k on their deathbed, they talk about the life they lived. Which, yeah, by the way, if you don't like thinking about death, you definitely shouldn't read this book. It's like a goth at a mortician's convention. He talks about death a lot. So Perkins' advice is to spend aggressively on life experiences that are going to make memories, and to do that earlier as much as you can so you can maximize those dividends. In fact, from the perspective of maximizing your life enjoyment, sometimes it actually makes sense to go into debt in order to have a positive life experience earlier. Now, he doesn't advocate for being irresponsible or setting yourself up for failure. After all, you don't want to hit zero before you die. But because of how important timing is for life enjoyment, you need to prioritize your enjoyment now, if you're able, instead of hoping that 68-year-old you is somehow going to make up for all the experiences you didn't have when you were younger. They're not. And this actually segues into my other favorite idea from this book, and that's the time bucket method. We're all familiar with the idea of a bucket list, a list of things that you want to do before you die. But if you actually look at your bucket list, you'll notice that some of them are much more time sensitive than others. If I want to take my kids to Disney World, I probably want to do that before they're 25. So Perkins recommends taking that bucket list and then drawing a timeline between now and when you're probably going to die. Again, a lot of death in this book. Break that timeline up into 5 or 10-year chunks, and then look at your bucket list and think about which periods of your life does it make most sense to do each thing. This gives you perspective on what you should be aggressively saving up for now versus what can wait until a few decades from now. Now we'll get into my issue with this book. And no, it's not the idea of inheritances. I've actually already made a video about this. If you want to financially benefit your family or charities, it actually makes more sense to do that while you're alive. Not only because that will bring you more joy to see that money actually being spent, but because often you're going to be giving it at a better time. Most people would rather have a lump sum of money in their 20s or 30s than in their 60s or 70s, when a lot of people get an actual inheritance. And a lot of charities would rather have the money that you're saving now, because the compound effect of all the good that can come from what they're doing right now could be greater than if they get a greater amount of money later. So that's not my objection. I actually really like that part of Perkins' book. My concern is what I call the problem of hyper-optimization. There's a lot more guts to this book than what I've given you here. I've really just given you kind of a flyby of the big concepts. Perkins recommends using an actuary calendar to try and roughly estimate when you'll die, so you can get closer to dying with zero. He recommends calculating your peak net worth when it makes the most sense to start spending down your fortune aggressively. And he's constantly talking about how if you don't follow the advice he has, then really you're just choosing to live suboptimally. And I don't know that he's wrong there, but it did lead me to a question. Can we optimize our way to being less happy? I have read scads of research about what makes us happy, what doesn't make us happy, how to avoid being unhappy, all this stuff. And it's made me start to think about, does all of this concern about being optimally and maximally happy actually have a negative impact on your happiness? And I was surprised to find that there's actually a pretty robust debate about this in the world of psychology. In theory, the happiest person would be someone who maximizes all of their opportunities to be as happy as possible. They eat the healthiest but also tastiest food. They do the most optimal morning routine. They work the perfect amount of hours. They spend their money optimally, all this stuff. Economists have termed these people maximizers. But in the 1950s, an economist named Herbert Simon came up with a new term, satisficers. Satisficers. That's how it's spelled. I don't know why. Satisficers are people who, rather than being concerned about being maximally happy and optimal at all times, instead simply focus on, is this enough? Is this okay for me? And there's been a lot of study into which type of person is actually happier. This study compared the attitudes of maximizers and satisficers with a number of life decisions. In one particular study, they had them reflect on an inexpensive and an expensive purchase and think about how it made them feel. And across the board, maximizers experienced far more regret than satisficers, which in theory doesn't make sense. They probably have the better product. They probably optimized for their situation. But the more psychologists have studied this, the more they've started to see reasons why this might be happening. One reason is expectations. The more options you have and the more you're focused on finding the optimal option, the better your outcome has to be in order for you to feel like it's acceptable. Consider the paralysis you feel when you go through just one streaming service's absolute litany of movies. You know there's a lot of options, so there has to be something good in there. The more options we have, the higher our expectations are. But also, the more choices we have and the more we focus on optimizing, the more we feel like it's our fault if we get a suboptimal result. If we wind up watching a dud on Hulu, then that must be because I didn't do a good enough job of researching which movie we ought to watch. And this is why so many of us wind up looking through streaming services for half an hour and then giving up on watching a movie anyway. We'd rather not experience the potential regret of finding something that doesn't meet our standards. So if we put a pressure on ourselves to always use our money in the most optimal way we can, we are setting ourselves up for a much greater potential for regret, which is actually sabotaging the very happiness we're trying to optimize. Not only that, but there's a growing body of research that shows that the more we try to get the most happiness out of everything, the less happy we tend to be. This seems to be because there's a subtle difference between aspiring to happiness and concern for happiness. Aspiring to happiness is just wanting to be happier, setting goals to try and set yourself up for a better experience. As far as we can tell, that seems to have a very positive effect on your happiness because you're being intentional. But the dark side of that is concern for happiness. Aspiring to happiness is going, what could I do to make myself more happy in the future? Concern for happiness is looking at where you're at right now, think about how happy you could be if you had done something differently, and then feeling less happy because you're not as happy as you ideally should be. It's the ultimate self-sabotage. By thinking so hard about being happy, you make yourself miserable. And this is why the second time around, I found myself less and less a fan of Perkins' mindset of hyper-optimization. If we make everything in our life about maximizing for optimum happiness at all times, then we are going to find ourselves constantly comparing where we're at with where we should be, which is going to make us less happy. One example of what I'm talking about is in a chapter where Perkins is talking about giving to charity. There was a woman who apparently quietly amassed a fortune over a long period of time and then gave away $8.2 million to a number of charities. The newspaper wrote about it, everybody thought she was the greatest person ever, and Perkins is like, actually, she could have used that money much more optimally. And I get what he's saying because she could have given the money earlier and that could have done all these things and blah, blah, blah. But isn't that kind of a stark way to look at life? Everything is either an optimal, happy, good decision or a suboptimal, depressing, bad decision. I'm not saying that that's what Perkins himself believes, but I could see someone taking that away from this book and ultimately wondering why they have so much regret about their life when they're supposed to be living their life as optimally happy as possible. One of the questions I want to ask with these book reviews is this book spendful? If you're not familiar with that term, spendfulness is just knowing who you are, knowing what you care about, and using your money in alignment with that. It's a way of living authentically to yourself with the way you spend your money that has made a lot of YNABers feel more confident and more content. It's basically the whole thing that YNAB is built on. And I'm really torn about whether this book is spendful. Because on the one hand, it encourages you to be really intentional with your money and intentional toward your own happiness. It encourages you to aggressively spend on experiences you enjoy instead of just saving up money so you can have a higher number. That's spendful as heck. Of course that's spendful. But I worry sometimes that even with the YNAB method, we can get ourselves in a trap of thinking we have to be as happy, as optimal as possible, or else we're doing life wrong. And this book kind of dogpiles onto that idea. When spendfulness or dying with zero becomes a chore or a moral duty, it starts to undercut the very thing it's trying to promote, your well-being. So do I encourage you to adopt the die with zero mindset? Sorta. Yeah, think about your money as a means to an end. Think about the importance of timing. Think about memory dividends. I'm all for that. But don't try to quantify every single purchase and experience in your life to see if it is making you maximally happy and somehow shame yourself or feel regret because you're not achieving enough happiness. There are no happiness police. Nobody's going to come arrest you because you made a suboptimal purchase or you saved too much money. Something that people have been observing for thousands of years is that if you try and grab happiness too tight, it tends to slip through your fingers. So Die with Zero is a great way to aspire to happiness, but don't let it become a thing that makes you concerned about your happiness. So those are my thoughts. Thanks for watching, and in the immortal words of Wicked, I hope you're happy.